All right, thanks for stopping by Minnesota Black Robe Regiment. If you are not a subscriber, please check that out. Make sure that you are. If you are a subscriber, check out the bell icon down below. The bell icon will help you get notifications when my content comes up. We're going to be doing more of these live streams. Monday night is now going to be a thing. I have the next 6 weeks of Mondays booked for guests. And that's a thing now. I'm kind of enjoying it. I didn't know what to think at first, but people appear to enjoy it. And there's this other thing too here on live streaming on YouTube. Now that I'm a big deal, I have people that lose more subscribers in one show than I gain in a month. Anyway, there's a thing called super chatting. So you can pay me to just flap my mouth. It's like being a lawyer or a philosopher. Anyway, I also have merchandise. If you haven't noticed, I've been telling people about coffee and it's been going pretty well. In fact, as a matter of fact, a friend, my friend Kevin, who's going to be on with us tonight, he just bought 2 bags after I harassed him and he just bought them. So I'd shut up and leave him alone. That's not true. He bought them because he likes coffee. He likes good coffee. But I have merchandise, So anyway, let's get to why we're here tonight. So I met Kevin a few years. Oh, Tomsky. Seriously? You just paid me to talk about my coffee and tell you where to get coffee. I don't know. Can I ship coffee to Great Britain? Isn't there some sort of embargo from the war for independence still? Anyway, thank you, Tomsky. Kevin and I met through another Kevin, which is why we call him K2, because K1 introduced us. But Kevin, up until a few years ago, was living down in Davenport, Iowa. We became friends because of this other friend. We have pretty much the same theological perspectives. Kevin is Reformed. Kevin is Calvinistic. And Kevin was going to a church at the time that, I met the people there. I have a love for the people in the church that he was in, but it's not the kind of love that you would have for, let's say, if you're a Christian in a local body. The same thing. I have a love to see his church, his former church, his former congregation, the leadership especially. I have a love for them in that I'm praying for them to be saved and to turn away from the doctrines that they teach. This is going to be an interesting conversation for Tomsky tonight because Tomsky will be coming on next week. He's following Kevin up. Tomsky is my resident, loving, faithful friend who's also an atheist, and yet we get along. And he's from Great Britain. I think he feels like he has to be friends with me because we beat the crap out of his nation several years ago. Hey, Judson, thanks for stopping in. But anyway, so Kevin and I got too many names in my head. Sorry, Kevin, you can make fun of me when I bring you on. Oh, you lot dumped the tea because you were fools, but we still like coffee. No, we dumped the tea for many of the same reasons that there's going to be some dumping going on here in the very near future in the United States, I think. No taxation without representation. But, we can debate that next week there, Tomsky. And you don't have to super chat me every time you want to say something, but you know what? Go ahead. Keep it up. That's awesome. Anyway, Kevin and I became good friends very fast. We engaged in street ministry together. We engaged in ministry outside of abortion clinics. Our friendship blossomed, our brotherhood blossomed, and I was able to, what did he say? Tomsky, you're throwing me off. You could talk, but now you got to let me finish my introduction here. Our friendship blossomed, and I was blessed to be able to walk with Kevin through one of the most difficult parts parts of the last several years of his life as he walked away from what we, not euphemistically, but very honestly, call a cult. And Kevin's going to come on. He's going to tell us a little bit about that experience, and we're going to use that platform to talk about the church in the West, but in particular the church here in the United States Republic and its response to authoritarianism, and why it's very important for the church to get this right. So if you are a Christian, please be prepared to have your toes stepped on. Also be prepared to have your eyes opened up a little bit. Pray for us if you would. And if you're not a Christian, I think this is going to be a really interesting conversation for you to pay attention to and ask questions. And please ask questions throughout. When I find a good stopping point, we will be asking, we'll be sharing those questions, and we will be answering them. But listen for the first few minutes as Kevin comes on and tells his story, because this is really important, because people don't understand that Christians are very good at circling the wagons at times when they shouldn't. And I think Kevin can attest to that. But Christians need to be better at calling out churches that abuse. They need to be better at calling out misunderstandings within the church. They also need to be better at calling out things that we have often believed that are not biblical. And we see that all the time. Name something that you believe or were taught was in the Bible, but actually wasn't or isn't. We see these memes and these questions going around quite a bit here within the Christian world, the Christian subculture of social media. And I'm always surprised by the things that people get upset about when you point out that it wasn't in the Bible, and it's not in the Bible. So, ladies and gentlemen, without any further ado, I would like to introduce to you to one of the most intelligent, compassionate, merciful, and gracious men that I have ever met in my life. And I'm not saying that out of a desire to schmooze him, because Kevin can't be schmoozed. But he is definitely one of the most gentle, compassionate, and most intelligent, intellectual Christian men that I have ever met. And his story will move you no matter what your socio-political or philosophical perspectives are. Kevin, thank you for being willing to do this and filling in kind of, well, not last minute, but last minute in some respects. When we were having this conversation yesterday about this individual that I introduced you to, and how this kind of sparked this conversation and where it's going. Kevin, tell us a little bit about your experience there in Davenport with your former congregation there.
Yeah, wow. Thanks, brother. I mean, I really appreciate the kind things. I mean, I'm not so much sure how true they are, especially the intellectual part, but you know,
you graduated for college.
You know,
you just got your master's degree.
No, it's not a master's.
Oh, it's not a
no, but it is an official seminary degree.
Well, that's it. Your shot. You'll never be worth a darn anymore.
Right. Yeah, I know. I mean, I've had to argue both sides of this point now that, you know, it's not necessary. I used to argue that point. It should be the total responsibility of the local church. I've argued that position, and now I've come to argue the other position.
Well, hold on, because I think this is important to the conversation, and we'll get to your portion of the story as far as what happened to you. But I think that's pivotal to where you were at, in that it isn't necessary for a Christian to go to seminary to be able to be an elder, to be a pastor, to be a teacher, whatever the case might be. But without a certain amount of oversight on a person who's in that position, it can be incredibly damaging. And I think that's what you oversight and training, especially. And I believe that's really where you were, because the thesis of the show, if you will, tonight is the role of elders, or some of you would refer to people as pastors or preachers or whatever, but the role of an elder, of a pastor, is often misunderstood in the Western church, but especially here in the United States. And you lived through that.
Yeah. And, you know, you you say a lot of good things there that I think could just lead us down, 5 different trails of conversation. So for one, coming from a Reformed tradition, both you and I, we believe that a plurality of elders in a local church is the most biblical thing, accompanied with deacons, all being men serving in those roles, not open to women in those specific roles. The other thing that I've come to have much more of an appreciation for. So this can be handled a couple different ways, but number one is I think that there needs to be some kind of an oversight to the local church. I think totally independent churches have set themselves up for trouble. Even if we go back to our English Puritan friends, particular Baptists, they had associations in those times. They were churches.
They were not strictly independent of one another.
Right, right. And if you read through the 1689 Confession of Faith, the Second London Baptist Confession of Faith, you will see this. And you will see this in chapter 26, which was a point that I've argued with the former church. We'll call them by name, Grace Fellowship Church in Davenport, Iowa.
No, we can call them what we euphemistically in our little group of 3, our little triumvirate, Grace Fellowship cult.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, I even pushed for that. Like, hey, let's bring in somebody else. But, there are good Baptist networks. I still consider myself a Baptist. I think, but I've had conversations with you. I've wrestled with this idea of Presbyterianism. I think that having sort of the political governmental structure that Presbyterians have in a good Reformed Presbyterian church is a good safe check against some of the abuses that occurred at GFC and many others, as I've come to find out. I preached a sermon not too many years ago at a church here in Albuquerque where I live now, and it was discussing church abuse, and of course our mind goes to Catholicism. We readily put them as the primary chief offenders of abuse and child abuse and sexual abuse. Well, per capita, the Baptists aren't too far behind them. So, there is a lot of abuse in independent Baptist type churches, and it won't just be Baptists. There will be others as well. I didn't carry my research too far, but there's a lot of this that goes on. So now I've forgotten what we were originally talking about because I got
polity
so
and oversight and Presbyterianism. And this is all right up Tomsky's alley since he's still watching, because he's from England. He's, they gave Great Britain, the British Isles gave us Presbyterianism and the London Baptist Confession of Faith. I speak London Baptist Confession of Faith English, Tomsky, so I can keep up with you.
Well, we do love the Baptist Confession, the 1689, because it does, it does keep guardrails on our orthodoxy, and I think that's important. I'm eager to watch the show next week. I've heard about Tomsky, and I'm eager to watch and hear what he has to say, and I know you guys will have a good conversation. And you and I, as you mentioned in the lead-in here, we've engaged in street evangelism and preaching in the open air and abortion ministry, and we've had many conversations with professing atheists, and I'm always encouraged. I'm not there to win the argument. I'm there to appeal to the person, appeal to their intellect for sure, but also appeal to their within their heart that God has placed his image upon them, and therefore that they are they have the image of God, that they know right from wrong without being taught it. All these things that are within them that indicate that there is a God and that they have been created and not just an accident of a cosmic explosion. So, another rabbit trail, but let me just
You might have to
say,
watch
well,
next week and make comments in the chat while Tomsky's talking, and then we'll have to do a follow-up
hey,
so you and Tomsky can have a conversation.
yeah,
So, and Kevin, here just
that'd be great.
so people are aware, Kevin, you and I have talked about not only where you were at with your former congregation, but because of the amount of street ministry that we've done together. One of the things that we talked about is this ineptitude within Christianity, where their go-to is to look at atheists, especially, and deem them as unworthy of our time, and then to say because they're atheists, they're all just purely immoral. And
yeah, I agree,
we've had
brother.
those conversations oftentimes because of where you were at.
But you know what I think a lot of that is they're not prepared. They don't know how to answer those questions, and so
and you mean Christians,
yeah, or professing Christians, but Christians, let's call them Christians. They're unprepared to answer that. Well, where did God come from? And the silly questions. How many angels can fit on the head of a pin? Can God create a rock too big that he can't lift? All these silly questions, and that intimidates people. But if we boil it down to its base, we come to some very profound truths that need to be dug up and explored. And no person is different. If you're a false Christian, or you're a Muslim, or you're a Jehovah's Witness, or you're an atheist, or you're just a pagan, there are all similarities to these conversations that are rooted in certain things that the Bible directs us to that are true. And, you and I accept them as truth, not blindly accept them, but we believe that they're rooted and grounded firmly, not only in God's promises, but also in historic actual facts and, things of this nature. But,
right?
I'm eager to hear, and I love a conversation with an atheist as much as I love a conversation with a Muslim, because those are really usually pretty rich.
Well, Kevin, you've heard me say this, especially over the last few years, but I actually enjoy my conversation with my atheist friends oftentimes more than I do with people who profess to be Christians.
Yeah, I mean, and I know what you mean. Yeah, I hear you.
The people who will walk up to me, in the days where I was still out there on the streets more, and actually engage in a conversation with me on an intellectual level, more often than not are the agnostics and the atheists.
Yeah.
More often than not. Most of the time, the people who give me the hardest time, the people who are the most judgmental, the people who are the most likely to condemn me, critique me in a negative light, not in a, hey, I appreciate what you're doing, but the people who are the most often the angriest are people who would tell you that they're Christian and have been Christian their whole lives, and on and on and on. Now that we've got those rabbit trails out of the way, you were in, and there again, ladies and gentlemen, this is a very important part of the conversation. You were in a church that was authoritarian.
Yeah.
Oh, hey, let me answer this question real quick. Or Kevin, you can. Tomsky wants to know what's the difference between a pagan and an atheist. And what I would tell you, very simple, and Kevin, correct me if I'm wrong. The biggest difference is an atheist would have make the statement that definitively, as opposed to an agnostic, definitively, an atheist says there is no God. An agnostic says, I don't know, there could be, there might be, but I'm not sure. So I'm just going to kind of live my life the way I do. What a pagan is, I want to say this very carefully because paganism has a lot of different definitions, but paganism is basically a nature worshiping blending of a lot of pantheons of different religions.
Yeah, I think that's really good. I think we can also, there's going to be a lot of different branches of paganism, as you've said.
Almost like within Christianity.
Yeah, different sects. And so, like hedonism, right? I think who's the most famous hedonist that I can think of might be like Charlie Sheen. All he does is seek pleasure, right? Got him in a little bit of trouble, but that might be considered pagan. Maybe they don't. Is there a God or isn't there a God? Who cares? I'm just here to live my life and have a good time.
And within Christianity, the most famous hedonist is John Piper, who wrote Desiring God, which was a dissertation on Christian hedonism.
Yeah.
So
a whole other rabbit trail, isn't it?
So, but anyway, you were in an authoritarian church.
Yeah.
And people need to understand that, like the cover photo, the thumbnail for this video was authoritarianism. And that hits close to home for a lot of people in the viewing audience, both here in this, or not both, but totality in the States, in Canada, because we have people from Great Britain, Canada. We have people from the independent sovereign nation of Nevada watching right now. Hello, Ragamuffin.
Kind of like New Mexico.
What we have to understand is that authoritarianism doesn't know it doesn't know a boundary, and it often starts in a very small area, in a small enclave, so to speak. And Kevin, that's where you found yourself, was in that authoritarian community. It was very much an authoritarian communitarian mentality at GFC.
Yeah.
And
so kind of bizarre how we even ended up there, but we did, and the story pretty well, and I don't want to drag this out too long. I'll kind of give a condensed version, but we found ourselves in a church that had gone through some struggles. A guy came in to be, try out for the pastoral position. He became hired. This was around 2008. Jen and I, my wife, we had been attending the place. We're really confused. I mean, I think, whether I may still argue that I was even saved in this church. I think Jen believes she was saved previous to this, which is fine. Not really make all that much difference. But, as we began to, the pastor's name, Mike Reed, he did preach differently from what we had heard from most people in any kind of churches. So he would call it expositional preaching. And I guess in a sense, yes, because he would open the Bible and work through books of the Bible verse by verse and all that sort of stuff, and try to expound upon the scriptures, explain the meaning of it, give context, give background, give these sorts of things. So it was very different. We were like, wow, this is really interesting. So and he was a Calvinist. He was Reformed, and so we didn't really understand this stuff at that time, but it was interesting to us, and it piqued my intellectual side, which is very small, despite what you might say. But
ladies and gentlemen, a disclaimer: Kevin is incredibly intelligent. He's also entirely too humble.
Thanks.
Go ahead.
But so it did. I wanted to learn more, and I began to, I became kind of ravenous for reading the Bible and studying and learning more and buying books. And, I guess didn't have the book buying habit as bad back then, but the church had books and they gave us books, and that was pretty cool. And I got my very first systematic theology book from Mike Reed, the, Grudem. We don't need to holler at Grudem, but whatever. It was good. I learned a lot. I began to understand systematic theology and learn it. And I grew up in a church, so I understood the Bible to some degree. Years go by, and, Mike was invasive into your life. I mean, he wanted to know a lot. I mean, he wasn't afraid to ask questions, and he wasn't afraid to probe. And so, those things became, to some degree, would be used against us at some point in time. And as, as time went on, my wife, who is smarter than me, began to notice issues. And because in the church, women are treated differently than men. And, men are kind of held to a higher esteem and women are a little bit lower. And,
Well,
so
let's make it clear what you're talking about in this situation. You're talking in particular about GFC, not
correct.
in the totality of genuine. Boy, here we're gonna.
Yeah.
You know my love for logical fallacies. Well, talking about them, not using them. Um,
Mhm.
the
Right.
uh, the reality is that GFC had a very abusive, disproportionate emphasis on the importance of men over women, and
Yes.
that is not a Christian perspective.
Right. And let's be clear. We're talking about my former church.
Yeah, I did not want to get engaged in the no true Scotsman fallacy there. Well, true Christians would never, you
Right.
know.
Right. And there's a lot of authoritarian churches out there that take this approach. And so it's not just them, but we're talking about them specifically. So anyway, as life went on and Jen started having concerns, and a few years later, a couple of years later, I guess, we really began to having some of these conversations, and she wanted to really, I guess, allow me to see it. And what really helped me to start see this more clearly was a couple of young men came to the church that were friends of mine, sort of outside, and they moved to Iowa, and they didn't want anything to do with the church. And I'm just like, what's going on here? And so, as we, Jen and I started having conversations about it, I guess, and I started recognizing it. And one of the advantages that I had in my career was I travel. I got to go to other places, and I knew a lot of people around. And I started having conversations, and so we became aware. And then we said, "Hey, we got to try to do this the right way, the best that we knew how." And so I started having conversations with Mike about what we would term legalism. Uh, Legalism is, people will talk about legalism. Legalism is a fruit of authoritarianism. And I think that's important to understand that authoritarianism breeds legalism. And so, what is legalism for maybe those that aren't in the Christian community? Legalism is, in its truest form, is trying to achieve some level of legal status that puts you in a right relationship with God. Well, that's impossible, and most Reformed Christians truly understand that. But the legalism that goes on at GFC and places like it is more of a, hey, you need to conform to the standards of this church, and not the standards that Scripture calls, but our interpretation of the standards of the Scripture. Like, let's say perhaps, if you shouldn't wear jeans, you need to wear skirts, and skirts need to be below the knee. And actually, it's better if they're all the way down to your ankle. So these are, really, sort of, uh,
If you want to think about this in terms that a non-Christian, or maybe somebody who's culturally Christian would understand, um, think of Islam.
mhm,
Islam is an incredibly legalistic
yeah,
religion,
yeah,
and
to an extreme, of course, right?
yeah, obviously to an extreme, but it also that and here's where I actually would kind of disagree with you to some degree. I actually think that legalism results not from authoritarianism, but results in authoritarianism. It
Mm.
A desire to always be doing everything exactly the right way results in putting somebody in charge of you, putting somebody over you to
Mhm.
rain down their dissatisfaction with your behavior and your conduct. so that they're up there watching over you and keeping check on you so that your behavior falls in line with exactly what they say. And I think that ties into where we're going to be going here shortly with this conversation.
Yeah,
So
that's good.
You lived in this environment
Yeah,
where there were
so
people over you telling you constantly what was right, what was wrong, what you needed to do to stay in the good graces of leadership, the good graces of the rest of the congregation. And if you stepped out of line, if some of this should be ringing a bell for my non-Christian friends or my nominal Christian friends right now, does this not sound like woke culture to you?
Yeah. Yeah, listen, I love this quote. This is a seminary professor. I'm taking one of his classes right now, but he's deceased. He's passed away years ago now, but his teaching is recorded. But he said this: some of us, when we were Christians, were in circles, perhaps fundamentalist circles, some of you, where there were all kinds of rules. And if you followed the rules, you were regarded as one of the elite, as a better Christian than your brethren, more holy. But the problem was they weren't God's rules. They were aesthetic rules. Don't handle, don't touch, don't go, don't see, don't this, don't that. Things that God had not required. And things in the end of the day were of no value in helping you mortify your remaining sin. That was exactly what was going on in Colossae. That's Robert Paul Martin. That's a great quote, because here's what it comes down to. You're being judged by the standard that the church leadership, and it starts with the leadership, but it filters out to the people. So what this ends up doing, and this was really the case at GFC, and I expect it still is, and it might even be more heightened, it sucks the joy out of life in this church, because you're constantly being judged by how you look, what you say, what you do. If your kids are in any kind of activity, God forbid that they would do something that doesn't meet the approval of those in the congregation. Now, the exception might be the hypocrisy is, if you're a major donor to the church, why, then you might be able to get away with it a little bit more, because you have some pull with the pastor. And that's true of GFC. Leading family is able to do pretty much whatever they want. Now, the most recent family that left, their daughter was wanting to be in dance, and they weren't the leading supporting family, so they ended up leaving and being excommunicated, like everybody else gets excommunicated. So that's kind of a flyby.
Yeah. So you're in this oppressive environment. It's had a very negative effect on your relationships.
Yeah.
Um,
Family,
on your
marriage,
family, and
children.
marriage, children. You and I had some incredibly hard conversations, and I know that you won't mind me bringing this up, but you used to send me, oh no, you need to be fully submissive to your elders, and I know you remember that. I would ask the question, well, how far into my life does the authority of the elders or the pastors of the church extend? Does every single decision that I make need to be run through the elders? And the long story short of that, which will surprise anybody who's ever watched any of my shows or any of my videos, was basically it came down to, your response was, yeah. Is there any decision that you should be making that isn't run through the elders? And
yeah.
And I'm not saying that, please, I want everybody to understand, Kevin and I are friends, but we're brothers in adoption through the shed blood of Christ. And so when I say these things, these are things that we've talked about publicly and privately. And so I'm not saying things to embarrass him, because he's held me to account on stuff, and we just had some really hard conversations. And I started to share concerns with him about where he was at in the church. And I'm like, I'm not real. I don't know, man. because it was a burden.
Yeah.
It was a burden. Like
Well,
they do things that like I wish other churches would do. Like I have a detractor in the audience who watches my Facebook content and has admitted to kind of shadow watching my YouTube channel, who's expressed some discontent with my content over the last couple of years, and I get that, but and Kevin, I've shared some of that with you, but here's this thing is like, here's this church that they're all about preaching the gospel.
mm-hmm.
And I mean, they're like, that's their life. And I'm like, I wish that churches that I didn't think were dangerous had the same passion for preaching the gospel that they do. And they preach the gospel when they're on the streets, when they're talking to people one-on-one, they preach the gospel. I am not going to tell people that they don't. They know the gospel. The problem is they twist everything else.
Mm-hmm.
And so they get the gospel right, but they get a lot of other things wrong. And so Christianity, especially here in the West, in the United States and Western culture, misunderstands the extent and the importance of, and I want people to understand what I'm saying here. The gospel is not the answer for everything.
Right. I mean, it's like the ultimate solution to everything, if you will, right? The ultimate solution is that you're saved, and when you die, you go to heaven. I'm not going to argue.
Shed blood of Christ.
Right. I'm not going to. But there's more things going on in the world, is your point, that we can have concern over that are not specifically related to being a gospel issue. We'll get into this: government authority and government submission to government authority and that kind of a thing. It all kind of stems in the Christian world, what you and I talked about yesterday. How do we submit to the authority of eldership or leadership in our church? And, I'm by nature generally more passive than some people. So I don't always go, it's not always my goal to rock the boat. I'm not saying yours is, Todd, but you do it more than I do.
Yeah, no, you can go ahead and say it. That's fine.
So, that's no secret. You and I comment often. We've been good for each other. I kind of help calm you down at times. You kind of rile me up at times. We both need that. We both need to move to the left or move to the right a little bit more in some of our things. So, we have to have an understanding that our submission to the authority of eldership or church leadership, pastor, whatever you want to call it, whatever type of an organization you're in, that's not unlimited. And in fact, it should be very limited. It should be very limited to things that, I don't know, might be really blatant. Like if I leave a church, I shouldn't be kicked out of a church or excommunicated just because I had I felt a legitimate reason to leave.
Let's address this from this perspective, and then I want to answer Judson's question that Pirate super chatted so we'd see. Sorry, guys. I'm trying to watch the chat. I'm trying to respond to you guys, and I'm trying to listen to Kevin. I'm one man. KD says, honestly, this religion stuff is over my head. Kevin, just keep listening. I'm pretty sure I know who you are. There's too many Kevins tonight. I'm going to have K1, K2, and K3. Sounds like I'm talking about CBD oils now.
Well, I don't want this talk to be degenerated to where if somebody isn't like where we are on this stuff.
Don't worry. I'm about to turn us. Trust me.
Okay, good.
So those of you that are patiently watching, please keep watching and tuning in, and then share this out, because this is about to take a turn that I think people really need to understand.
Yeah.
Judson asked this question. I think this is also very important to the topic at hand. Could you address a relationship between dogmatism and legalism? Yes. For me, dogmatism, everybody's dogmatic about something. And dogmatism in and of itself is not bad. Unbending, unyielding dogmatism can be dangerous. And but if you have a belief within Christianity, oftentimes we refer to it as conviction. If you have a conviction, if you have a strongly held perspective on something, that's dogmatic, because you're ultimately going to end up sharing that dogmatic view with your friends and your families and your neighbors and your coworkers and whatnot. And you're going to want to instruct them in that dogma. And a person who is truly curious, is truly willing to learn, is going to be willing to listen to your dogmatic approach to something. Now, if somebody comes along and presents to you clear, rational, reasonable, understandable evidence that maybe there's something in your dogma that needs correction, you'll bend to that. But if you're presented with something that says, without any reasonable doubt, I don't care what you present to me, I'm just going to continue to cling to this, that's dangerous dogmatism. Now, what legalism is within Christianity especially, is this fundamental foundational belief that I know all of the answers, and I know what is ultimately right and what is ultimately wrong, and I know exactly what that needs to look like in your life. And I'm going to hold you to the standard that I have established, and I'm going to demand that you adhere to that. And if you don't do that, I'm going to make your life incredibly I'm going to discomfort you. I'm going to make your life uncomfortable because you're not adhering to my standard for what you should be doing. And that is a huge difference. We see dogmatics everywhere. And actually it started well before the inception of Christianity, in the sense of looking at the life of Christ and his death, burial, and resurrection, and so on. So legalism is death. Dogmatism is clinging to, sometimes rightly, sometimes wrongly, a set of convictions and beliefs. It's just what you do with your dogmatism that matters.
I would say, you and I would say we are dogmatic about the triune nature of God. There's one God, and he exists in three natures, Father, Son, and Spirit, and they're all equal, and they're all eternal. They're all of the same essence. And so, that's really hard for people to grasp. But Muslims, Jehovah's Witnesses, Mormons, they do not believe in the divine nature of Christ. So we're dogmatic about that.
Right.
Legalism is just a set of standards that you try to hold other people to in this sense that we're talking.
Right. So thank you, Pirate, for pointing out what Judson asked. So here's why this is foundationally important. For decades, maybe for decades and decades and decades, Christianity has seen this shift here in the West, but especially in the United States. We have watched as the leadership of the church has gone from being servants of the people, and some of you are going to start to pick up on this. The way the church was intended to be operated, if you want to use the term operation or managed, the elders were not meant to be these authoritarian rulers over the people. They were meant to be servants of the people, to help the people, to be a guide to them, to reflect for them the life of Christ. And and Paul says this: if you want to follow Christ, and I'm paraphrasing, if you want to follow Christ, follow me, or don't follow me, follow Christ in me. What you see me doing as I follow Christ, follow that, but don't follow just me because it's me. And what the American church has done since, honestly, since the war for independence has been this increasing ideal or idea or ideology that the pastors or the preachers or the elders or whatever terminology you want to use, they're not servants anymore. They are authorities.
Mm-hmm.
They are leaders, if you will. And if they tell you something, you don't get to question it. And if you do question it, there's something wrong with you, because don't you know whether these men have been to seminary or they've been picked by the right people within the congregation? If you question them, you're questioning God. If you look at this now, in Kevin's case, and in the case of the individual that we mentioned anonymously earlier, that's dangerous. These people are heavy-handed in what they do, and Kevin will tell you he's still dealing with the repercussions of that. Several, like 3 years, was it 3+ years down the road, he's still dealing with the repercussions of what that has been
Mm-hmm.
in his life. But there is a reality in which, even in churches where you're not dealing with authoritarians in the heavy-handed nature, the legalism, is that many Christians, and these are true believers, blood-bought, adopted Christians, are still looking to the pastors, looking to the elders of their congregation, whether it be, Presbyterian church or Baptist or Methodist or whatever. They're looking to them for all direction at all times. And that has had an incredibly detrimental effect on the Christian church in the United States. And we've seen this play out, especially over the last 2 years, wherein the vast majority of Christians in North America, in churches that actually meet in church buildings and have a body of elders, a body of pastors or whatever, have followed every single dictate that has come down the line to them from the ruling authority, because they have been conditioned to follow whatever they're told to do by their elders.
Yeah.
And in a nation that still considers itself fundamentally Christian, I would argue that it's not, but there are still people that say that the United States is still fundamentally a Christian nation. Christians are guilty to the subservience to dictatorial authoritarianism, not just because we want to do things that are good for our neighbors, but because they have been conditioned to follow orders from people in positions of presumed authority. And that often starts within the church.
Well, this has, I guess, to some degree gotten you in trouble, right, Todd? I mean,
gee, Kevin, I don't know. What do you mean?
So because, you do have a passion for evangelism, you do have a passion for reaching the lost, and over the past, couple years, I guess, really, since the whole COVID thing kind of kicked in, it was like you became more political in your activities than completely gospel oriented in your activities. And so some might see that as, hey, you've betrayed the gospel, or you're not, but of course, we can't put we don't know I don't know what's going on in your daily life. I don't know who you're having conversations with. And I know you well enough that even though if you're acting in a political activist role of sorts, that given an opportunity, you're still having a gospel conversation where it yields an opportunity. And so I don't see this as a betrayal of the gospel. as it's a redirection of the gospel. And government is important in our lives because they control a lot. If we haven't learned over the last 2 years that government is important in our lives, you might as well just go check yourself into some kind of a clinic and forget about it, because we can see what has happened. Government has seized control when it had an opportunity to seize control. And who stands against that? Well, whatever the opposing political party is supposed to, but that doesn't always work out so much. And I think even the very name Black Robe Regiment, people have to understand that there's a history behind that. Now, I wasn't incredibly aware of that. I didn't know to the degree at which those men that I admire so much, or at least sit on some of the books on my shelves, the Puritans and these men that were political. I mean, they preached political sermons. And in fact, the dear 1689 confession that I mentioned earlier has this whole section on civil government and it says, I pulled it up. I pulled it up in modern English. 24.2.
You see that little share button down below? You think you can figure that out to share that?
Yeah.
We don't even want pictures of you in a Speedo or anything. So
let me see if I share a screen.
I think you should be able to do share and then share a tab or a window.
Let's see. Let me do that one and allow. I think this will do it.
Yep, there we go.
Okay. So founders.org is a wonderful ministry. Tom Askell. They have translated, or I don't know where the translation comes from, but they have it posted on their website, the 1689 in modern English. So it's a little easier to read. Doesn't have to read Old English. But I like point 2. Christians may lawfully accept and carry out the duties of public office when called to do so. In performing their office, they especially maintain justice and peace according to the wholesome laws of each kingdom or other political entity. To carry out these duties, they are authorized now under the New Testament to wage war in just and necessary situations. And you can see the scripture that they will highlight to support their case for that.
Right. And that's what I think people need to understand, is that Christians have been on the forefront for millennia, frankly, on resisting tyranny. And it has looked different throughout those millennia. I mean, we're dealing with 2 millennia, basically, of that. In Jerusalem, in the early days of the church, the resistance to tyranny looked like telling the Jewish council that you've told us we're not allowed to talk about Jesus. And there again, please people understand, I'm paraphrasing because I don't want to drown you in Christianese. I hate Christianese. But you've told us we're not talking about Jesus and we're not allowed to preach about him anymore. And we're going to tell you we'd rather obey God than obey man.
Mm-hmm.
And they were imprisoned for that. Paul, who, many of you are, if you're Christian, you know who Paul is. But Paul was a massive persecutor of the church and then became one of the apostles after he had a very interesting experience with the God-man. And went on and told to tell Caesar, I'm not going to bow to you. And then he was beheaded because he asserted his rights, if you will, as a Christian to not be crucified. Instead, he had to be beheaded because he was a Roman citizen. Now, probably not the direction you want to go here in the United States, but
Yeah.
it's still, this is why this is fundamentally important. Because some of my Christian detractors will say, you spend all your time talking about liberty. You spend all of your time talking now about how government is infringing on your rights and on your liberties, but you're supposed to submit to government. You're not supposed to be interested in your rights.
Mm-hmm.
Tell that to Paul. Paul said, I don't want to be crucified. Please, I beg you, behead me.
Yeah,
you're going to find me guilty. I just don't want to die the way that you would, the way you would execute these other Christians, because that's going to be painful. Now, I don't want to hyper spiritualize this, but Christians have been on the forefront of resisting tyranny. The whole, not the whole, that would be a mischaracterization, but a predominant theme throughout Scripture is standing up against unlawful, unjust, wicked rulers. Period. Over and over and over and over again. Ancient history is replete with Christianity or with Judeo-Christian values doing that. And some of you have listened to some of my conversation about things like the doctrine of lesser magistrates, the doctrine of interposition. That's not new. That didn't just start in, pre-1776 colonial North America. That started way before the New Testament was ever written. And it's lived on, and we saw it carried out in places like Germany during the Reformation, when you had a tiny little German city stand up to the Holy Roman Empire under threat of death and starvation, and said, no, we're going to resist you because you're an unlawful authority.
Well, I think the Acts verse that you cited, here's something else that I think is really kind of pretty heavy and profound. But at the very beginning of the book of Exodus, we know the story that, Joseph died and the Hebrews have become enslaved in Egypt, and they're growing exponentially, far outgrowing the Egyptians, and the new Pharaoh is afraid that they're going to take over. So he instructs the Hebrew midwives to kill all the male Hebrew children that are born. This is why we end up with Moses and the bull, in the little ark and put in the water and all that kind of stuff. But listen to what this says. It says, so the king of Egypt called the midwives and said to them, why have you done this and let the male children live? The midwives said to Pharaoh, because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women, for they are vigorous and give birth before the midwife comes to them. Okay, so, in effect, they've lied to Pharaoh, right? I think they have. They've distorted the truth. Now, there might be some truth to this, but they've bent the truth. And it says in verse 20 of Exodus 1, so God dealt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied and grew very strong. God dealt well with them for their lies and their deceit to Pharaoh, because they were saying, you shouldn't kill. You shouldn't murder these children. So we're going to step in and we're going to take this under control and do it ourselves. And we're not going to allow these children to be killed. And so God was pleased with that. And I think it's really a challenging verse for modern, what do you call them? What, WCC, Western Christian culture?
Western Christian culture. Yeah.
Yep. So this is a challenging verse for Western Christian culture to think, wow, they, or some of our atheist friends might ask us the question, well, what do you, if you're a Christian and, the Germans come to your door and say, where are the Jews hiding? It's meant to trap you, right? Well, you can't tell a lie. Well, there are ways around that, if you will, that are pleasing to God, that sort of maneuver. And it gets kind of tricky because people think, well, I've got them, they're going to tell a lie. But God in his own word tells us that he dealt better with these midwives because they did lie to the Pharaoh and they preserved life rather than submit to tyranny and the murder of all these children. And so, can we transport this to a modern context? about taking a COVID shot, perhaps. Where do we?
Kevin, I have to correct you from this point forward. If you're going to mention that particular thing,
Oh,
you have to call it
coof.
the
Sorry.
coof. Yeah,
Yeah, sorry about that. Coof shot.
Man, you just got me demonetized. Tomsky, it's on you. You got to keep me alive financially.
So we really start getting into modern context that gets very tricky to deal with this stuff, or it seems to be tricky, but I don't think it's as tricky as what people think it is.
Yep.
But yet, to your point, and maybe the reason for this show is that we're sort of conditioned to think, man, I just got to do what my pastor tells me. I just got to do what government tells me. You got to wear a mask in church. Okay, we got to wear mask in church. 2 years later, we're still wearing masks.
Because government has said, and are there passages, Kevin, and you and I know this, there are passages, and I refer to this often, Romans chapter 13, 1 Peter chapter 2.
Yep.
Submit to the ruling authority because God has appointed these authorities over you for your own good. But what we so frequently miss is that there to be a terror to those who do evil and comfort, for lack of better terminology for my friends, to those who do good and righteous. And it doesn't say only Christians do righteousness. Kevin, you and I have had this conversation. There are people out there like, if you're a Christian, you can't do anything righteous at all. And if you're not a Christian, you just can't. It's impossible for you to do anything that's righteous. And I'm like, I got news for you. The non-Christian person who does their best to rescue children from being slaughtered in abortion is doing more righteousness than the average Christian in Western Christian culture does.
Yeah, I agree.
And so I want people to understand that here. I'll give you an example. And if anybody from my current congregation sees this, I guess I'll deal with the repercussions. But here, back at the beginning of February, the mayor of the city where my church is, in Rochester, Minnesota, issued an edict. And I use that terminology intentionally. Here's this edict from on high from the mayor of the third largest metropolitan area in the state of Minnesota, said, from this point forward, all places of public accommodation will require all people to be wearing masks at all times under the threat of, it wasn't a criminal issue. They were going to go after the businesses or other places, and they were going to find ways to sanction them through fines, the removal of licensure, and whatnot.
Yeah.
That was issued on a Saturday. I immediately sent a text. I said, hey, what are your guys' plans for this? We weren't planning on talking about this. Later that day, an email comes out, and it is, we're going to ask that everyone come to church and they all wear a mask throughout the entire service.
Yeah, you know what? I say shame on them for not thinking about it, for one, not knowing what they're going to do, for two, and for caving, for three. I mean, it's just like,
I'd actually put number 3 at number 1.
Yeah. Okay, fine. I can, I'll put them all on an even plane. It just happens to be, let's put them in alphabetical order.
So here's why this is so important. Once again, we have been within Christianity in particular conditioned. If your elders or your pastors or whatever say you do this, you do it. You're not allowed to ask questions.
Yeah, like what does Vodi Bakum say? The 11th commandment is be nice, right? You got to be nice. I mean, if you're a Christian, that's the whole thing. You're supposed to be nice. Well, I don't know. We lived in one of the most locked down, strictest state in the country in New Mexico because we're very, very blue, and I refuse to wear a mask anywhere. And maybe that doesn't seem very nice to people. It would embarrass my wife to some degree, I think, at times, but I'm not afraid to be confrontational in those situations. And I can still do it, in a calm and collected manner, but I can still be confrontational. And so those things we ought not to be nice in that situation. I mean, it drove me crazy. One of the churches that we were attending here was, how all the elders would wear masks. I'm like, why are you doing this? What is your point? What are you trying to show? And I shared with you a few things about one of the things that I sent to one of the elders in my sort of kicking back against that a little bit. And this particular elder was kind of ignorant to that situation, and I don't know, maybe it helped somewhere down the line. I have no idea. It's not my concern. And there were churches around that stood firm and did really good things. I mean, I think Grace Community Church, whether you like John MacArthur or whether you don't, I mean, I admire how firm they were and resolute they were in their resolve.
But let's be honest, and I caught some flack from people because the from the get, at first they said, "Oh, hey, this might be something. Let's follow."
Mm.
And it didn't take them long. It did, and it brought some heat on me because people need to understand that within the United States, there is a little bit of a view of a guy like John MacArthur that, well, and Grace Community Church, like, they're kind of the end all and be all within a certain group of people who would consider themselves Calvinistic.
Right. Yeah, I hear.
Who hold to the 5 points of Calvinism, or tulip, if you will. That MacArthur holds to those, and if he says to do something, you should probably do it. And I came out against that. And I'm like, I'm really disappointed in this. Now, they changed their tune very relatively quickly for an organization that's as large as it is. They changed their tune relatively quickly, and they said, no, we're going to fight. And what happened? The state came against them.
Yeah.
And literally the state, but also Los Angeles County came against them. And they ended up losing because Grace Community Church fought back. Now, Christianity Today, not the newspaper or the website, but Christianity Today, Western Christian culture, would have you believe you don't fight against the state. You don't countersue. You don't say no if the government tells you to do something. You do it because God's appointed the government. The conversation I was having with an individual on my way home today, it was funny. He called me as I was getting ready to leave work. He says, TC the Warrior. And I'm like, well, that's ironic because I was just having this conversation with somebody else. And he says, I mean it in a good way, but that led into another conversation, or another portion of the conversation, which was, what is the responsibility of the Christian? What is the responsibility of the church? And it brought up this, and he talked about this from his church service yesterday, that sometimes God does lift up evil rulers and evil nations even to judge other evil nations.
Yeah, for sure.
And
I mean, the story of Jonah, and then two books later, Nahum, that's exactly what happened. The people repented at the preaching of Jonah, but a generation and a half later, the Assyrian Empire was completely destroyed.
Right.
And God did that. There's no doubt.
And so let's think about this. For all of those Christians out there who are now waving in tandem the Christian flag, the American flag, and the flag of Ukraine, and demanding that we go to war for Ukraine, not with, but for Ukraine against Russia. Could it be, I'm not saying it is, I'm not a prophet, I don't play one on television, but could it be that Russia, as a government, has been brought in, and this is particularly for Christians to think about, Russia's been brought in to judge the wickedness of the Ukrainian government?
Yeah.
Could it be?
Sure.
Could it be?
Yeah.
Could it be?
I don't say for sure in meaning for sure that's what's happening. I say for sure that is a real possibility. Now we
And
also
it could be a
understand.
judgment on the American government, on
Yeah, I
the
mean,
state of the federal state, especially of the United States Republic, because we allowed them to create this mess. And you
right.
want to know who's responsible? And Kevin, if you think I'm overreacting here, it's we the people, because we've allowed this to happen,
Yeah.
because we've submitted to this and we haven't been doing our part. And who's at fault the most? And this is why I encourage my non-Christian friends to listen, because I'm going to nail Christians to the wall here. You've been blindly following.
Hmm.
You've been
Yeah.
blindly
Well,
following.
yeah. I mean, come on. When it's on the news, and if it's even on Fox News, and they're
Ooh,
and they're
don't you dare talk about the fourth person of the Trinity.
right, and they're pounding the narrative. This is what we're hearing. So, listen, I'll sort of put in the disclaimer. There are true Christians in Ukraine that are suffering, and most likely some dying, and innocents dying, and it's tragic. And we're not saying any of that. We're talking strictly on a political level as to, or a higher, a God's providence level or God's decree level as to what's going on here as it relates to governments and God's judgment on peoples. I mean, this is all very true.
Kevin, because I put this up there. A dear family member that I love knew that I did not vote for Donald Donald Trump the first go round. Kevin, you know how vocal I was.
Mm.
And it wasn't for the same reason as the never Trumpers within Christianity. I had some other things. I had some concerns.
Yeah,
I still have concerns. I had concerns about him going into the second
right.
campaign. But one of these people reached out to me after he was elected, and they said, "So how do you feel about it now?" And my one response, and I have to admit, I was probably being a little bit, excuse the terminology, ladies and gentlemen, I was being a little bit of a smartass. I said, I said, John Calvin famously is quoted as having said, "When God wants to judge a nation, he grants them wicked rulers."
Hmm. Yeah,
And like him or not, Donald Trump was not the epitome of what Christianity would have people believe as a godly ruler.
right.
I know that my subscription base now just went from like 1,200 and some to
Well,
about 50.
you know,
But
I don't know about all that, but I think the reality is, as a conservative, as a more, maybe even a more libertarian minded myself, I do appreciate Donald Trump's policies. I think that they were healthy for the nation. Obviously, I mean, we had things under control seemingly. The dude's a narcissist. There's no doubt about that. I mean, but that was kind of maybe good for the world, that you would just never quite know what this guy was going to do. And it obviously, they know what the guy in there now is going to do, which is pretty much nothing.
cave in and capitulate to everything that they want.
Yeah, for sure. So, you know, uh, Donald Trump is not a godly man or a Christian, at least from what I can see and tell. But policy wise, I'm okay with his policies in generally. But you know, I think he's better than what we got going on right now. And I don't know what's going to happen, but we're not
I
here to
have holy
prognosticate
socks that are
that.
better than what we have going on right now. So
Well,
Judson said this in about our conversation here a little bit ago. Being nice and being kind are two very different things.
yes.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, he's right.
And
Kindness
I think he was
kindness
saying
is a
that
biblical concept, a biblical call to be kind. We should be kind.
right.
Being nice is more about people pleasing. I
Yeah.
just don't want to upset somebody.
Well,
Kindness is a genuine reflection of trying to help somebody.
a few years ago, I wrote, Kevin, you know this, because I shared it with you. I wrote an essay a few years ago about the difference between being nice or what it meant to be nice. And ultimately, when you go back to the etymology of the word nice, it meant to be worthless.
Yeah.
And let's just be honest. This is going to upset a few people, but the vast majority of people within Christianity, both visible, nominal, cultural Christians, and even true Christians, they're worthless in their impact. They have no impact. They make no impact at all on their society, on their community at all. What are you doing to make a difference? And that's what I want people to understand. Christianity should be on the forefront for resisting all of this garbage. But yet, what do we see? Things like critical race theory, critical sexual theory, critical gender theory, critical feminism theory. All of these things are making massive inroads into denominations across the United States because we're so busy being nice that we're not being kind enough to tell these people what you're doing is wrong.
We're not being effective as Christians.
Exactly.
And, I did appreciate what you said regarding GFC in relationship to their evangelism efforts. Because they are evangelistic, they desire to preach and share the gospel with people. Okay, I get it. But see, what they've done is if they've become imbalanced in their approach because, they're so focused on that. Like, that's another form of legalistic legalism that they do. Like, what did you do this Saturday? Did you go to the farmer's market and preach, or did you pass out tracts somewhere, or did you, have you talked with your grandma because she's about ready to die? Did you beat her up with the gospel? So they become, there are other elements to Christianity that are important in the local church: discipleship within the church, hospitality within the church. There are a lot of different elements to church and church growth, if you will, other than just being heavily focused on evangelism. And I'm for evangelism, as you know.
Oh yeah. Like if anybody wants to doubt my level of commitment to Christians going out and sharing their faith through evangelism in whatever form it takes, or yours, it's going to have a pretty terrible fight on their hands apologetically, because are there better apologists in the world than me? Absolutely. And I'll be having one of them on Friday night. His name, K-Dub True. Some of you know him because he's been on my friend Carrie Smith's program. But he's a phenomenal apologist. But when it comes to apologetics, I don't know anybody that's has a better heart for it than Kevin. And in apologetics is a foundational part of evangelism. But the problem is that we don't apply that across the board for everything that we do. We're not fighting back against the inculcation of a wicked culture because we've been so concerned about being nice. And we have had this drumbeat of submission to authority, which has been browbeat with this. Some of us in abusive churches, some of us in churches that aren't abusive, but submit. Yeah. And I've read emails over the last 2 years. We have to understand how we can be truly honoring of those that God has placed in positions of authority over us while also remaining obedient to him. And the thing is, not every single situation demands that we remain obedient to those that have been placed over us while also being obedient to God, because at some point that becomes impossible. And it makes the Christian here in the United States, in this republic, feel like I'm sinning if I don't obey the government. And some of you know I hate using that term government because in the United States, and Kevin, you and I had this conversation over and over and over again when you were still at GFC. The highest ruling authority in the United States is the Constitution. the Constitution, and then we the people.
Yeah.
So if I'm going to be obedient to the government of the United States, I'm going to obey the Constitution, and then we the people.
Yeah, that makes it difficult, because like my well-intended friend, he's like, I've never heard that before, or I don't see the Constitution isn't a person. I'm like, okay, well, I suppose technically you're right. It is not a person, but we, the people, are people. And,
Right.
the people are supposed to be administrators of the Constitution. I mean, the whole Supreme Court nomination, I mean, what they're trying to judge is, are you going to interpret the Constitution, not dictate law from the judicial branch. And this is, where just basic civil understanding is so wrong in this country. It's so dumbed down that they're just, people don't even understand basic government and how it works.
Right. And that's why I want people to, that's why I could be sitting here, ranting and raving that more of my Christian friends should be watching this, but it, I'm thankful for every single person that is watching and who has stayed tuned in, because what I want people to understand is that Christianity, especially here in this Republic of the United States, has been on the forefront of leading against authoritarianism. The problem is we have subjugated ourselves to authoritarianism with our own local bodies, and we can't resist authoritarianism in local government or state government or federal government when we're also submitting ourselves to authoritarianism within our local bodies wrongly, because we have flipped the importance in the local body of those elders to the point where we see them as an end all and be all authority. And when you do that, then you have to see everything that they say and everything that they do as ultimate.
Well, this is pretty simplistic, but I think it's accurate. It becomes a Protestant version of popery, that your local pastor or eldership board becomes, the Pope in Protestant circles for your church. You must, obey him because he watches out for you. Hebrews 13:17. If your church is citing Hebrews 13:17 a lot, using it, I'm not saying you can't ever use it as a pastor, but I think if it's being overplayed, there's a problem there. That was one of the, I mean, I said to somebody here at the local church, I said, I've never heard you guys ever talk about Hebrews 13:17. And that was perhaps a weekly verse coming out of Grace Fellowship. Weekly, I could almost say for sure, but okay, maybe twice every 2 weeks. It was a constant, refrain. So those things apply to churches. I think it applies to government. And, if we don't have a voice, I mean, look at Canada. What has happened in Canada? That has become a dictatorship, right? Am I missing something? I mean, it's become a dictatorship.
No, I think you're 100% correct. And, and we had one of my friends from Canada, who was actually going to be on the show here on a Monday night coming up here in the near future. Well, feels like near future when I've got things scheduled out for 6 weeks, but to talk specifically about that. Is obedience to this is what's so strange for me. So are Christians in Great Britain or Christians in Canada or Christians in other places in Western culture, is their obedience different than ours? is it exclusive to the United States? Is the church different in the United States than it is in Canada or Great Britain or Australia or whatever? And I'd say no. And Kent's here saying he's the one I'm talking about. He's going to be coming on here in a few weeks. Their experience is in Canada is far different than even ours. And things here in the States are not perfect by any stretch of the imagination. But look at what the Canadian authorities did to people merely for giving $5 or $10 to a truckers convoy. There again, I understand it was not just a convoy. It was a protest, but they seize these people's money. They shut their bank accounts down. And you want me to tell my fellow Christians in Canada, nope, submit to that because those are your ruling authorities. So if they're going to just take your money, you just let them because gosh darn it, God says you have to obey them. And in the church, as I've said before, for millennia, for at least 2 millennia, has been on the forefront of saying, no, that's evil, that's wicked, you're hurting these people, they don't have to obey.
Well, it seems to me like in the European countries, from at least what I've seen, right? I don't tune into mainstream media, legacy media, I guess we might call them. But
Yes,
if you see, the protesting in the UK and in Italy and Australia, Austria, where these things, I mean, these people, France, Paris, my gosh, they have massive amounts of people just, in these streets. And I mean, they're serious about their protests, but I don't know what we've done about protesting here in the States. It doesn't appear like we've done a whole lot.
The irony of what you're saying, Kevin, is that one, I would say the church should be on the forefront of that.
Mm-hmm.
I don't care what your denominational flavor is. The church should be on the forefront of that. 2, as I told my now friend, the doctor, those of you that haven't seen it, my dissident doctors conversation, that 4-part conversation I had with Chris from Nova Scotia. Like, here's our annoying little brother to the north, right? Canada being the annoying little brother to the north, without the same amount of liberties that we have enshrined in the Constitution. We're seeing churches up there that don't have the protections that the church in the United States has, standing stronger and standing firmer, which I believe actually ultimately ended up giving a rise to the truckers convoy, which then started to have an impact on the rest of that country. And yet here we are, and I made this point today on social media. Legacy media reports about this horrible assault on Chris Rock by Will Smith. And every person on my not every, I'm over exaggerating, on my social media feeds are talking about how, look at this as it was staged. Look at how evil this was. Look at what Will Smith is getting away with. We're talking about everything but what's important in this country right now. And Christians have fallen for it too. They have fallen for it as well. And
I think one of the concerns here is everybody just wanted to get back to status quo. I won't use the word normal, status quo. And it's really like the only smart thing I think the Biden administration has done is they finally told people, let off of this stuff. Get rid of these mask mandates. And all of a sudden the people go back to being people, right? And so I'll include myself in that. I'm not nearly as mad or agitated as I was. Now, we went and had a hamburger last night at a place, and there's 2 20-year-old kids working at the hamburger joint, both wearing masks. And I said, these are 20-year-old kids. Their chances of dying from COVID are 0.
Coof.
you know, in the 40s, 20-year-old kids were storming the beaches of Normandy, and these kids are wearing masks working in a hamburger restaurant. What has happened to manhood? I mean, for one, but this country is like sissified. I mean, we are so, honestly, man, there's so much weakness in this country. It's pathetic.
Well, here's the thing, though, and I'm not going to say this. If you want to wear a facial covering for the coup, for whatever the case might be in public, I'm not going to jump on you for it. That's your decision. If you want to do it, I don't care. Go ahead. I'm not going to chat. Okay, I might chastise you or castigate you if you're out on a run by yourself on a really nice summer day,
Or in your
and you're
car
wearing
by
a mask,
yourself.
and your dog is wearing a mask. I might say something to you, you know, and it probably will be mocking. I will probably mock you for it, but I don't care. If that's what you want to do it. But don't expect that I'm going to do it for you. And guess what? Christians, that should be your position as well.
Yeah,
Period.
and I'm being a little harsh on these kids, granted, because I'm tired of the whole thing. But what saddens me really more than anything, brother, is not that I would be angry at these kids. Again, we talked about this. They're created in the image of God, and they have value, and they have worth, and I care about them as human beings.
Right. I get that.
What troubles me is that this is what's happened. This is what our government, this is what our new world order has done to people, is scared them so much. I assume these guys are genuinely scared that they might catch something and get sick. And that's where the criminal activity happens, is they know this isn't a big deal for 20-year-olds. They know
Right.
that 5-year-olds don't need to get vaccinated. I mean, it's not even like hardly a cold for them. So this is all, you know, and you can't get this stuff out in the public because they won't allow it. And you know, that's where this overreach, and this whole conversation is, who pushes back about this stuff? You know, I did the best I could to push back, and I refused to wear a mask unless I had to take an airplane ride, and they'd throw me off the airplane if I didn't, and I'd lose my job. But you know, I'd be slipping it down every chance I got.
You horrible coward.
Terrible. I mean, it's awful. But I mean, and I don't know. It's just I'm so tired of the whole thing. But it is amazing what can happen to a people. And you know, you've seen it on Facebook. You wonder if you would have gone along with the Nazis. Well, people ought to darn well know that they probably would have.
See, oh wow. See, so I've been saying this right now. I'm glad that you said it, because I've been telling people, you want to know who'd go along with the Nazis? It had been you, not you, but that's what and maybe that's an extreme comparison. It might be, in the eyes of some people, it might be, it might actually be like way too far, but that's where it always starts.
Yeah.
It starts with the simple things. It starts with a people's willingness to comply. And I was thinking earlier with some of this, especially with Christianity, the response has been, well, what's it hurt? What's it hurt? What's the problem? Why is it bad? What could possibly, if wearing a facial covering could possibly save even so much as one life, and they want to make it a mandate and tell you that you can't go to the grocery store and you can't go to a restaurant. You don't have to go to restaurants, so who cares? Well, you know, if you need to get groceries, what does it matter? Just comply, just comply. And it made me think of Niemöller's poem about the Nazi regime, which is ultimately at the end, he said, I didn't stand for this group, I didn't stand for that group, and I didn't stand for that group. And when they came for me, there was no one left to stand for me.
Yeah.
And
that's what happens.
And that was Christians talking, because Christians in the Third Reich stood by and said, they're not coming for me, so what's it matter?
Well, this is why it's so relevant with the authoritarian churches, I mean, I guess the best analogy is being a frog boiled in a pot, where the water just comes up to temperature. And I think it was over the past weekend, and I've seen the movie many times, but Jen and I, again, we watched the movie Valkyrie with Tom Cruise. It was the plot to assassinate Hitler by Colonel von Stauffenberg, I believe was his name. And, and of course, as Christians, we know that Dietrich Bonhoeffer was also involved in that. And so this really does kind of factor into that, which is this a biblical thing to do for a pastor theologian, as Bonhoeffer was considered, to participate in a plot to assassinate a political leader? I mean, it's really one to wrestle with, but at the end of the day, I mean, he came to the conviction that that was a better thing to do.
Right. Here's a fellow Minnesotan here who I think he and I would have a wonderful conversation, because I know we share some we share, or not share, we have some differences in ideology, but on some things, but also share a lot of the same mentality on much of what's going on. Fisherman in a Box says America has no Bonhoeffers. I beg to differ, sir. Kevin and I'd say that with some caution because this is YouTube. So, but I think you're right when it comes to leadership. I hate that term within Christianity in the church, but within the church, they're very few, if any, and they're not being platformed the way they should.
Well, I appreciate his statement. I mean, I think it's really hard to draw a direct parallel comparison because, to some degree, we're executing far more children in the womb than Nazi Germany ever dreamed they could, get rid of. So there's that, but it's not all coming from one central figure. That's the leader, i.e. Hitler. So I don't know, tough to make that comparison, but I appreciate what this man says. I mean, I think if I have to try to get at what he's saying, that has a few violently on his life for his God, country, and family. That's an excellent point.
And I would make one slight correction there to what he said, Kevin, is that it's God, family, and then country. Because if you can keep your family right, you can keep your country right.
Yeah.
But what we've done is we've made country God. We've made family more important than God. And then we lean on God to fix all the other things because we've gotten the orders all screwed up.
Yeah, and I won't judge him too harshly on that because
I'm just throwing that out there for the case of conversation. So.
I think that is the proper
Kevin's
order.
old, by the way, so we're going to lose him here pretty soon.
I'm an hour earlier than you.
You're already yawning.
Oh no, I was yawn. I did yawn a couple times. I didn't just now, but God, family, country. That is a good distinctive because God ought to be our first priority, our first relationship, our first love, and out of our love for God flows first and foremost our love for our family. I mean, that is our highest calling as Christian, especially Christian men, leaders of household, is to love our families, love our wives as Christ loved the church, provide for our children, take care of them until they're able to leave the home or whatever the case may be. So, but right on with this guy's statement, man. I mean, it's really a challenge today when we consider. And it was a challenge to Jen and I as we watched that movie Valkyrie, and we thought, man, these guys, they cared so much that they knew they were going to be
they were
executed. They knew it. I mean, they knew
it. Bonhoeffer was arrested, and this is, if Christian, non-Christian, if you do not know the life story of Bonhoeffer, and the fact that he was in the States and traveled back to Germany in the midst of all of this.
Yeah.
and then took up the mantle of resistance, was captured, tortured, placed in a concentration camp, and was hanged 2 weeks prior to the liberation of that camp
Yeah.
by Allied
Yeah,
forces.
it's almost like it's almost like this weird sort of tragedy, you know, where um, you know, he wanted to see this succeed and was willing to do this. And you know, it's interesting because they don't mention Bonhoeffer in that film, but I think he was probably associated with this group in some way. But you know, one scene where von Stauffenberg is at Hitler's home and Hitler's there, and the generals are mentioning the invasion of Normandy, and Hitler's like, what? Like he didn't even know about it. Oh, right, yeah. Or he had, and I don't know how accurate this stuff is, but it really is very fascinating because I mean he was a madman, no doubt. Um, he was delusional and didn't even recognize that the end was near. But you know, here these people, these men were, the liberation may have well been very close, and they could have tried to get out, or they could have tried to do something different, but they didn't, and they died
They could have
heroically.
surrendered. The war was going on. They could have traveled and
True.
surrendered, and they still
Right.
were willing to die. And that
Right.
was Bonhoeffer. That's
Yeah.
the church. My friend Kent from Canada says the big problem I had with mask rules was the expectation of service workers having to enforce them. That
Yeah.
was a
Boy.
terrible spot to put anyone in, right? And that's the
Yeah.
authoritarianism.
Yeah.
That, and I know this is going to sound like a force, but it's not. That's exactly what authoritarian churches
Yeah.
do.
Yeah.
They
Right.
put
So in
the members.
psychological terms, they call it a flying monkey, where a flying monkey does the bidding of the wicked witch. They go out and do the work that the witch is incapable of doing herself. So he's exactly right. These people get put in this position that they have to enforce these rules. And I read some articles about restaurants in New York City where they were supposed to um, you know, you were supposed to present your vaccine card, and they were just like, we're not going to do that because we get people mad at us no matter what. And so they'd get mad if they didn't ask, they'd get mad if they did ask, and they're just like, we're not the police, you know.
You know, it's funny that
Crazy.
you bring that up because I'm gonna on Wednesday, and I'm coordinating chats over here and whatnot. But on Wednesday, I'm going to be having a candidate for sheriff here in the state of Minnesota, in a
Mm,
county, in a metro area on. And one of the things I'm going to be talking to him about is constitutionally, what are you going to do if this arises? And people are saying, well, you're overreacting. Like, no, I think this is a question we need to be asking
mm.
people who are running for office now. Constitutionally, what's your response going to be to these things?
Yeah.
You know, and that's just foundationally and fundamentally important. Um, Fisherman says this again. He says, "You don't have a country, you'll have no family." Ask China and their one baby rule. I think I think that's a fair statement. Um, but I think China's problems went far further back than um, the loss of their nation. In that regard, I still believe that for Christianity, it's God country or God family country. And
Yeah.
oftentimes what I do, even if my family doesn't understand or appreciate it, the reason that I'm doing what I'm doing is because I'm watching out for future generations of my family, which also extends then into the nation.
Yeah.
And
I mean,
I think the church needs to keep that in mind as well. I don't want to quibble over a particular,
no.
I think Fisherman makes some valid points,
Yeah,
but
for
for me it's
sure.
still always going to be God first, then family, and then nation,
Yeah, you
or
make me
republic
decide
ultimately.
between this country and my family. That's a no contest.
Well, it's strangely enough, that's being done for a lot of people, and a lot of people are
True.
choosing the direction that the nation is going now over their families. So
Yeah. Well, I mean,
within the church.
this stuff has caused a lot of problems in families. I do know that. I mean, just over being vaxxed or non-vaxxed, and every family has I won't call them anti-vaxxers because they're not anti-vaxxers. They're anti-experimental gene therapy. But whatever. There's a lot of people that will refuse this vaccination. And then there's some that just think you're the incarnate devil if you do that. And so it does split families. But you and I are talking about our families, our immediate families,
Right.
our wife, our children, grandchildren, if we're blessed enough to have grandchildren. And so that's what I'm talking. And my parents, of course, I love my parents. I'm going to do everything I can to protect and fight them. And still, I still have a relationship with my sister and that stuff. So,
Well,
to
here's
some degree.
for a thought as we get ready to close here, because I've had you on for quite a while. For those of you that
Thank you
don't
for sharing.
know, Kevin and I were conversing before the show started tonight as he was watching me eat a quesadilla because I didn't plan my time well, and I came home and spent way too much time getting comfortable after work. But I have a family member who lives way out west in probably one of the most liberated states in the Republic. When most people think of it, they think, oh, there's rugged individualism. There's the American spirit of the West in this particular state. Has bragged to other family members about going into stores like Walmart and other in grocery stores and other department stores, bragged about belittling people for not wearing masks. And has attacked me in the family for my position and how dangerous I am. So there are issues, but I just want people to understand that I'm going to watch out for my family before I'm going to watch out for anybody else. And I'm going to do what I believe, where I'm convinced is the right thing to do. And that's going to be filtered through the lens of my faith and how I understand. And there again, I could be wrong. Anybody who says dogmatically, there you go, Judson. Dogmatically, I know for 100% that this is exactly the way God would have me do it here in this country. Is opening themselves up for a pretty hard correction at some point.
Yeah.
And Kevin, I know it seems like it's a stretch, but for your closing thought, and I'm going to kind of force you into your closing thought here. And thank you, by the way, Fisherman in a Box. This has been an outstanding conversation. I'm glad that you've enjoyed it, and I hope that you guys will share this around because I think this is an important conversation for the church, the visible church here in the United States to be having, not just in Minnesota, but all across the Western world, if you will. He says, thank you, and quibble away anytime. Iron sharpens iron. Iron to iron. Yes, absolutely. I agree with that 100%. Kevin and I have had a lot of those iron sharpening iron conversations. As a closing thought, would you still say that with the thought that we had conversed about yesterday, that a great danger for Christians is a misunderstanding of what leadership is in the church? Do you still think that's true after our conversation?
Oh, absolutely. I think that there's a grave misunderstanding of that, and I was a part of it. We're in a church that is a nice church. It's a good church, and I think by and large the leadership is solid. But if the opportunity comes where I have to stand against something that was said, in fact, something did come up recently, that I'm quick to send an email and say, hey, I don't know what you meant by that, or I don't think I like what I heard, maybe explain that a little bit more. Or if I clearly understood it and said, this is where I think you're wrong, I don't have any fear of doing that anymore. Because I
will tell you right now, ladies and gentlemen, that Kevin I knew several years ago would not have done that.
No.
What-
No. And so it's important because I think a leader in a church is first and foremost, a servant is, I think you mentioned that earlier. They need to have a shepherd's heart, a servant's heart to, and recognize that their authority is limited by the word of God and by God himself, God Almighty himself, that if you abuse those sheep for your own personal gain, you've put yourself in a really bad category. And I think that those things are dealt with very harshly. And I seriously, I mean, I'm not exaggerating, I'm not hyperbolizing. I have a great fear for these men that lead this place that we came out of, because I think that they first, I don't know. Are they all deceived into thinking that they're doing the right thing? I mean, how many people have tried to correct them? When you can never be corrected by anybody, there's a problem and you're probably a cult leader. And so there's that. But I don't know. Did I close? Did I answer your question?
No, you did. I don't want anybody to think that just because you're not in a particularly abusive church, or because you're not in a church that has that same authoritarianism that as its structure, that you aren't subject to having a misunderstanding of what submission means, A, within the church, and B, then to governing or ruling authorities.
Yeah.
It is foundationally and fundamentally important for the church, especially here in the United States, but in the West in general, to understand that we should be on the forefront of resisting evil, no matter what level it comes in at. You want it, like, judgment begins with the household of God, period. Scriptures are very clear on that. I get Christians all the time. You shouldn't be judging Christians. You shouldn't be telling Christians that what they're doing is wrong. You shouldn't be telling Christians that it's sin to do this. And I'm going, no, we should be. Yeah. First and foremost, my judgment is going to be the heaviest on people who claim to be Christian. My compassion and my endeavoring is going to be to have a wide and gracious and merciful response to the non-Christians.
Yeah, you're right. That's a very obviously, Matthew 7:1 is very misquoted, and we need to judge. We need to judge Christians. We need to judge the world around us, not to the point where we know authoritatively whether somebody's going to heaven or hell. That's being judgmental about people. There's a big difference. But making firm decisions.
I can judge the actions that I'm seeing and know that somewhere behind that is either a bad heart motivation or a misunderstanding of the scriptures, period. And I should be calling that out. And that starts with the church.
I'm not going to take my 10-year-old and my 8-year-old daughter down to First and Central in Albuquerque to do preaching with me, because it's a dangerous place to be. So I judge that it's dangerous. Is that bad? I mean, there's drug addicts and there's gangs and there's all kinds of crazy stuff that go on down there. That would
sounds like you're describing pretty much all of Metro Minnesota.
Yeah, well, it's pretty rough here. But I know, I mean, it's just like, we just have to use good common sense, and judgment comes in that. It's discernment. We have to be discerning.
Absolutely. Kevin, I can't thank you enough for your time. And there again, it wasn't a conversation that we had planned on having, but just this conversation we had with this gentleman here in my area who's going through some serious stuff right now.
Yeah, right.
I hope that he'll see this for what it is, that Christians can have they can have an intelligent, cognitive, intellectual conversation and point out the failings of the church, period. Yeah. And much of what we're dealing with these days in the United States lies squarely on the shoulders or at the feet of failures within Christianity. to do what it's supposed to be doing, because we have abdicated our role as watchmen or guards of the republic that we were given by our founding fathers.
Yeah.
Some of them Christian, some of them deist, who said the God of nature has given us these things, has enshrined these things to us. And now we're giving this to you. And famously, to quote, paraphrase Benjamin Franklin, when he was asked by the older lady as they came walking out of the Constitutional Convention, "What is it that you have given us, Mr. Franklin?" And his response was, "Well, a republic, if you can keep it." Well, a lot of that rests on the church, and the church has failed to keep that republic.
Boy, that's
You
a
were
good
going to say
point.
something.
Yeah, I just in our chat there, I just linked to the website link to a website that offers a lot of information on authoritarianism and those types of churches. It's directed toward our former church, Grace Fellowship, but it can apply to just about anything, and it can really help you discern authoritarianism and legalism and some of those things. And there's some good resources there. So if anybody needs more information about the topic, part of the topic that we've had today, that this is a good resource for them, and hopefully that would be helpful to somebody. And I'm grateful, brother, for you asking me. I know it was last minute. We just talked yesterday, and but I think this has been fruitful. Hopefully, I hope
so.
people have gained something, and it's always a joy to speak with you.
Did you have an IPA before you did this? Kevin, why don't you go get out of here and go spend some time with your family. I'm going to do a little bit of a close, and then I'm going to end this after you get out of here. So thank you for your time.
You got it. Talk to you soon.
Take care. Love you, man.
Love you too. Bye-bye.
So, hey, guys, I know it seems like a stretch, but one of the things I wanted to do is I wanted to stay in the root of what my channel was supposed to be for quite a while. And I've, I want people to understand that, like, there are times I don't represent my faith well. You just have to understand that I'm a fallible person. I'm a human being, and I have some anger issues with what was done to me. And I wear that on my heart on my sleeve with that stuff sometimes. But I'm also other things. I'm a veteran. I've sworn an oath to the Constitution as a vet. I've sworn an oath to the Constitution as a former member of the law enforcement world. Granted, I worked on the detention end. And what I've watched is the Constitution ripped up, spit on, tread upon by people who I used to work side by side with, people who also swear an oath to the Constitution, who are leaders in the United States, and the church in the United States, in this republic, has forgotten its role in the inception and the founding of this republic. We have become compliant, and we have become complacent. That's not everybody. There are Christians out there that are not. But we've become complacent, and we've become weak, and we've become cowardly, quite frankly. And God despises cowards. He despises cowards. And there's no place for cowards within Christianity. And so if you're going to come at people like me and say, "Oh, you've forgotten the gospel. You don't do this. You don't do that. You don't do this," or the gospel's the answer to everything, then you've forgotten the role of Christianity in the inception of liberty across the world. End of story. You've forgotten that. And it may not be that I'm the problem. You might be the problem. You might think I'm a one track. I'm only going one direction. I may not be the problem. Once again, if you're at all interested, working on putting up my merchandise and my coffee on the website and on the Facebook page and on YouTube. I'm going to be doing some merchandising through those 3 venues as it comes. I'm a Monday through Friday guy. I never thought I'd be there again, but I am. But it also takes a lot of work, and by the time Saturday rolls around, I'm exhausted. I've got 4 shows this week. I've had tonight. I've got my Veteran Nation podcast that I'm doing with Mike Skipper Arthur on 2 different networks. Tomorrow night we're talking to the guys from 22 to 0 on that show. I had them on here last week. Wednesday night I'm talking to a candidate for sheriff here in Minnesota, for one of the counties here in Minnesota. On Friday night I'm having my it's going to be a great conversation with KW True Chris, who is a black man in the United States who has conservative values, libertarian values, who rejects things like critical race theory. And we're going to talk about the importance of that conversation in the Republic, in the church, and in broader culture and society today, and why it's important that people get this right. That's coming up on Friday night at 7 p.m. as well. So I'm busy. So I'm a little behind on things. And I'm also going to be releasing very soon a conversation with a guy who's packing up, leaving his family behind, and he's going to go to the Ukraine and join the fight with the Ukrainian military against Russia. And I do my level best in this conversation to talk him out of that, because it's not a fight that we as Americans should be in, because we kind of created this mess. For those of you that are tuning in on Monday nights for this new series, I thank you so much for that. And I'm just going to ask you to continue to share this. Even after this live stream is done, share it. This conversation in particular, I don't care how long it is. I think people need to hear it. And if they're Christians especially, need to hear it. Those of you Christians who are here, thank you for watching. Non-Christians, thank you for asking questions and for commenting. And until next time, sic semper tyrannis.